Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Richard Raaphorst's film, Frankenstein's Army. So this is a Dieselpunk horror movie set during World War II on the Eastern Front. And at least according to the Wikipedia summary of the critical response to this film, it is not that well liked. Which is fine. But I actually think it's kind of interesting. I think it's much more interesting than some of the criticism quoted on the Wikipedia page gives it credit for. The sort of big theme of the critiques in, at least as reported on Wikipedia, I'm going to stop making that qualifier. This is where I've gotten this information. The big theme of the critiques seems to be the visuals are interesting and innovative, but the story is very slow and poorly developed. That's not entirely unfair. So the premise of the film is that there is a squad of Soviet reconnaissance troops moving east out of Russia into German-held territory in advance of the Red Army, 1934-ish, or 1944-ish. This squad is being filmed by a guy named Dmitri, who is a I think the term was political officer, something like that. Basically, he is a propagandist, and the ostensible premise of this project is that he is filming the heroic actions of this reconnaissance unit to transmit back to Russia, right? Back to the Kremlin for propaganda purposes. This premise doesn't make that much sense. This is a reconnaissance unit. They need to move very quickly. They need to be very light. They need to be very efficient. And cameras in the 1940s were not quick, light, and efficient. So this is exactly the opposite from a strategic perspective of what you would want done for a reconnaissance unit. And so that initial premise from a plot perspective doesn't make that much sense. What does make sense about it is that the film is presented as found footage, right? So what we see throughout this film is ostensibly what Dmitri captures through his cameras, which means we get a lot of shaky cam, right? Where like he's running or fleeing or whatever it is. We get a lot of very obscured camera shots where he's going into like dark hallways, whatever it is. So we get a lot of this, right? This filming technique, which is what it is, right? People in horror love found footage stuff. Totally fine. I have no problem inherently with that. I will say this is probably not a film that my partner could watch because she gets motion sickness with first-person perspective, especially with shaky cam stuff. So there's that. But this whole shtick of Dmitri is here, he is filming what this squad is doing, starts to make a lot more sense when we find out that, in fact, the squad is not just out doing general reconnaissance stuff, but they are on a secret mission that only Dmitri knows about, which creates some friction, perhaps justifiably. They are drawn by a radio transmission to this particular small village in the middle of nowhere. Supposedly, there's a squad of Russian soldiers who need assistance, and so they go to help. The problem is there's no Russian soldiers. What there is, however, is essentially a bunch of cyborgs. So these are human beings who have had various types of machinery grafted onto their bodies. So knives or giant claws for hands. There's one guy with a face that is a drill. Right, just crazy stuff. And what is revealed is that this is the work of Dr. Frankenstein, who's working for the Nazis, sort of. He's sort of working for the Nazis, he's sort of working for himself, utilizing the notes of his grandfather, the original Dr. Victor Frankenstein, from Mary Shelley's novel. And the squad is on a mission essentially to capture him or kill him if necessary. But the Kremlin wants Dr. Frankenstein and preferably his research. They would ideally like him alive because they want him to continue his work on behalf of the Soviet Union. So we got a lot of interesting stuff going on here, right? There are these sort of interesting ethical problems that the film grapples with. And on the one hand, I think they could do more with that. On the other hand, I don't think it's necessary to do more with it. I think it's sort of sufficient that these questions are raised. So one of the ethical questions is, of course, about the attempt by the Soviet Union to capture Dr. Frankenstein so they can bring him back and continue his research and his work. Now, I think on some level the film wants us to see this as a bad thing. Dmitri betrays his comrades, gets a number of them killed because he doesn't tell them what the actual mission is. He's not an especially likable character. And so I think we're supposed to see his mission as basically a bad one. And that's an interesting ethical position because both the Soviet Union and the United States, the Western Allies, did in fact snap up as many Nazi scientists as they could as the war was ending. In the US, it was called Operation Paperclip. It brought over a number of prominent Nazi scientists who became significant members of the US scientific and military establishment. Wernher von Braun, one of the most famous ones, right? He was a Nazi rocket scientist. And because he was a good rocket scientist, the US brought him over and made him a central leading figure at NASA, where he worked for the US doing rocket engineering. And he was central to our successes in the space race, right? The Soviet Union did the same thing. They brought Nazi scientists into the USSR and had them continue their research. So both sides did this. And the idea that this is somehow morally reprehensible is an interesting one because it does raise these sort of ethical questions, particularly around the fact that this is presented exclusively as a Soviet project of bringing in Nazi scientists, people who objectively work for this evil regime. So there's that element. But I think the more interesting one is actually one of the points raised by Dr. Frankenstein. When Dmitri finds him, Dmitri tries to make a deal with him, basically, where Dmitri sort of guarantees him protection in the Soviet Union if he'll just go back to Russia with Dmitri, right? Dmitri has his own motivations to do this. His family is political prisoners or something like this. It's not 100% clear, but that's what we get the impression of that, right? That he has made this deal where if he brings Frankenstein back to the USSR, then his family will be protected or released or whatever it is. Fair enough, right? And so we get this extended sequence in the latter portion of the movie where it's basically just Dmitri and Dr. Frankenstein, and they're walking around his lab. Dmitri is filming. Frankenstein is explaining, like, here is my whole shtick, right? Here's what I'm all about. And this is where it gets really interesting for me from a philosophical perspective. Frankenstein is obviously a psychopath. One of the things that he talks about is how, as a child, he says this thing where he says his dad had said that men would be more efficient if they had screwdrivers and hammers instead of fingers, something like that. And that sort of starts him on his path, right? And this is kind of striking because while he's clearly psychopathic and is not only willing to, but gleeful about the destruction of human bodies for his experimentation, what he's doing is not fundamentally that unusual. Right? And so what I mean by that is not necessarily that we regularly go out and destroy people's bodies, although on some level we do. There's a long history in medicine of experimentation on unwilling participants. In the US, for instance, that was often on African Americans, where the medical community would either not inform African Americans about experiments that were being done. They would take tissue from African Americans without their consent, whatever it was, right? Forced sterilizations, etc. All of the long history of incredibly unethical medical experimentation. But even today, right? So I wear glasses. That's a mechanization of the body to make the body more effective, right? I can see without my glasses. I just can't see as well. Now, this is removable. It's not permanent, but you think about things like laser eye surgery. You think about things like cochlear implants, pacemakers. All of these things are mechanizations or surgical alterations to the body in order to make them more efficient. And these are everyday things, right? You almost certainly know someone who's had a procedure like this, if you yourself have not, right? But even more so than this, we can think about something like, maybe the most sort of immediate example is the Neuralink implants that Elon Musk has pushed, right? This idea of you can embed something in your brain that will, in some sense, mechanize you. You become a cyborg, more so than, say, people with cochlear implants or pacemakers or whatever it is. You become a mechanically enhanced biological organism. So this is a thing that exists, right? This is an objective that science, medical science to a certain degree, has. But I think the more interesting issue with this is another thing that Frankenstein says in passing. So at one point, Dmitri accuses him of being insane after Frankenstein's like, yeah, I'm going to experiment on you. I'm going to graft the camera into your forehead. Dmitri's like, no, you're insane. Don't do that. And what Frankenstein says is something to the effect of, everybody is insane. The communists are insane. The Nazis are insane. The capitalists are insane. And it raises this really, really, really interesting point about how we pathologize individuals while not pathologizing states or ideologies. Because Frankenstein is right. Most of the people that he experiments on are either dead or dying. Admittedly, some of them he has killed, or his army of cyborgs has killed on his behalf. But the number of people that he has killed and what he's done to them is comparatively small scale. For the midst of World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history, tens of millions of people die. Millions of people die in the Holocaust alone, to say nothing of combat for 6 years plus. I mean, if you start the war in September 1st, 1939, when the official declarations, at which point you're ignoring, say, the Japanese occupation of Korea and parts of China and whatnot, as well as the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and stuff like this that comes before, but can arguably be lumped in as part of the sort of greater World War II metropolitan area, whatever it is, right? So this is a conflict in which tens of millions of people are dying horrifically. At this point, the Nazis have been carrying out the Holocaust for years. The Soviets have been doing general Soviet stuff with, the Stalinist purges and mass repression, etc., etc. The United States is actively working on the nuclear weapon, or an atomic weapon, which within a year and a half at most of when this is set, they will deploy against Japan. There is this strange paradox of Frankenstein is a psychopath who needs to be destroyed, and yet the three major competing ideologies of World War II, fascism, communism, capitalism, account for massively more destruction, death, and suffering than Frankenstein ever could as an individual, and yet they remain unpathologized in that way. Now, the Nazis are considered an insane movement, justifiably so, because they lost. If the Soviet Union, if communism and capitalism had lost, probably they would be pathologized within a fascist worldview. And indeed, fascists do pathologize communists especially, but the idea that World War II was somehow on a different ethical scale than what Frankenstein does is a very striking one. The idea of holding individuals accountable, but not holding the world as a whole accountable for the horrors of World War II, is an interesting ethical paradox.